Common folk can't be blamed for the interest of erotic scandals in a royal family. Based on their privilege and influence on the general public, who is doing who wasn't just great conversation for upper class and peasants, it was a matter of national interest. Passion among the royals led to beheading, scandalous divorces, and dividing of countries. Now, of course, both the men and women of royal blood were guilty of extramarital affairs, but the outcomes were often very different. Kings would go unscathed with a cover-up, while women would be lucky enough to be sent off to a nunnery for the rest of their lives. When we look to misbehavior from the royals, there are some famed stories including kings that throw over their wives and church for the love of someone else. Some have renounced their throne for love of another, while some scandals were a farce, like Catherine the Great having intercourse with a horse. There are some that are true, though hard to believe. King George II and his mistresses. In modern times, Prince Charles was thought not to deserve the crown because he had an extramarital affair with his now wife, Camilla Parker Bowles, while being married to Princess Diana. However, monarchs from the deep past were not only allowed to have extramarital affairs, it was considered weak if they didn't. King George II was happily married to his wife, Queen Caroline. Their marriage was harmonious and steamy. In fact, he needed to be dragged away from a passionate bout of lovemaking to be told of his father's death and his ascension. Despite his happy marriage, he took mistresses to show that he was strong. You see, a king without a mistress back in the 16th century would deem him weak or impotent. A weak king equated to a weak country, which could then be subject to attack. King George II was particularly fond of one mistress named Henrietta Dowd, whom he had an affair with for 20 years. He eventually dropped her as she began to age. Queen Caroline begged him to take her back as she was in fear that he would replace the devil she knew to the one she did not. Caroline's concerns were valid, as the king went on a tear with feisty lovers and at one point hung a portrait of one of them at the base of his bed. King Henry VIII. The king of bad boys was King Henry VIII, who not only had multiple erotic scandals, but was well known for his misdeeds of ex-wives. British schoolchildren are taught a rhyme to help them remember what fate lied for a wife of this king. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. King Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509, and throughout his reign, he had 6 wives. He wasn't considered a philanderer, but more of a serial monogamist, as each time he married a mistress, he created space for a new mistress. When he came to the throne, Henry was 18 and a virgin. He married the widow of his brother, Catherine of Aragon, and remained faithful to her for 5 years. It was only when Catherine got pregnant that he had an affair. This is because it was believed that having intercourse during pregnancy might lead to miscarriage. He made up for lost time once he realized how liberating affairs with noblewomen at court were. His conquests included Lady Anne Hastings and Jane Poppincourt of Flanders, who was a mistress of Duc de Longueville at the time. Henry had many illegitimate children, including a child with Mary Boleyn, the other Boleyn girl. Mary was the sister of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Anne and Mary's father was ambitious and willing to give all the women in his life to the king. He even offered his own wife, to which Henry declined, stating, "Never with the mother." When Henry would grow tired of a wife, usually some charges would be laid on her. They were, of course, trumped-up charges of incest or infidelity. Later in his life, Henry would commission Holbein, the artist, to go overseas and paint portraits of potential wives or mistresses. Anne of Cleves didn't live up to the portrait and was nicknamed the Mare of Flanders. Even back in the 1500s, catfishing was finding its way into the high stakes of royal dating, perhaps. Henry could be quite classless at times, using his power for evil. He had his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, beheaded for adultery, and threw a party afterwards with 26 ladies at his table. If that's not a double standard in modern days, I don't know what is. In the end, his son would die a virgin and very sickly. If one were superstitious, which many were back then, you'd think that perhaps there was some karmic justice at play. The end of King Philip IV's dynasty. One affair, known as the Tour de Nesle affair, ended a whole dynasty. It's a bit more complicated than that, as it involves 3 noble women and 2 extramarital affairs. Back in 1314, King Philippe IV of France had everything he wanted. The future looked bright, but secrets were lurking in the darkness that would crush the hopes and dreams of the dynasty. His daughter was Isabel, the Queen of England, while his 3 sons were married off to esteemed noble women that were all related in one way or another. Queen Isabel welcomed her new sister-in-laws to the family with lavish gifts. One of the gifts Isabel gave to her new sisters were expensive embroidered purses, which she would later see hanging off the belts of 2 brothers at a family gathering. The brothers were knights at Isabel's father's court and were well known for being excellent lance handlers. It was obvious to Isabel that the sister-in-laws had re-gifted the purses to the brothers because they were in fact lovers. Isabel informed her father, so he sent spies to see what his daughter-in-laws were up to. It didn't take long before 2 princesses were caught in the act with their lovers, while the 3rd princess was considered an accomplice. This all went down in a broken-down Parisian fortress called the Tour de Nesle. The lovers of the women were tortured terribly, including castration, flaying, and oil boiling. After the immense suffering the men experienced, they were eventually killed. The princesses had to live imprisoned underground in a dirty dungeon. Their heads were shaved and their children were disinherited. Soon after, the king died and his dynasty was no more. The French throne ended up being given to a distant cousin. Digging deeper into history, the Tour de Nesle affair was a catalyst for the 100 Years' War. The disagreement over who should inherit the crown caused the 100 Years' War between England and France. This put most of Western Europe into an armed conflict for most of the century. Princess Sophia Dorothea of Celle and the case of the missing count. Sophia Dorothea was beautiful with a charming character to match. She was the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick-Lundberg. Unfortunately for her, she was betrothed to her first cousin, George, who was so unattractive, he was known as Pig Snout. George had the potential to be heir to 2 thrones, so the Duke agreed to the union as it gave his daughter the chance to win the crown. Sophia didn't see this as a reward and fainted when she heard that she'd be marrying George. They married, and it didn't evolve into a fantasy fairy tale where kissing the frog would turn him into a prince. It was the exact opposite, in fact. There were reports of a loud scene and violent arguments happening frequently. At one point, George was found choking Sophia, and she would have died had one of the servants not intervened. So when the handsome Count von Königsmarck arrived from Sweden, a restless Sophia found him irresistible. When the Count arrived, he had a brief erotic encounter with the king's mistress, Countess Platen. In the end, though, he only wanted to be with the princess, and she desperately only wanted to be with him. They had a passionate, indiscreet affair and planned to run away with each other. They were recklessly in love, writing hundreds of letters to one another that were intercepted at times. The very night Königsmarck and Sophia planned their escape, he never arrived to meet her and whisk her away. He disappeared from court and was never heard from again. There were whispers that Countess Platen had something to do with the disappearance, taking revenge on Königsmarck, who had previously been her lover. Nobody was ever charged because there was no evidence found in the case of the disappearing Count. George was angry with the scandal and divorced Sophia, separating her from the children they had together. She was imprisoned in a recluse area while George went on to become King George I of England, the Queen and a physician. Within the royal unions, it was quite typical that a marriage was loveless, and this was the case for Caroline Matilda and King Christian VII. In 1766, Caroline was 15 and married her cousin, King Christian VII. This made her the Queen of Denmark and Norway. However, she was quite miserable and isolated, having no friends or allies. The king wasn't kind and neglected her, which might have something to do with the fact that he had a misdiagnosed mental disorder. To help Christian with his mental issues, he enlisted a reputable German doctor named Johann Friedrich Struensee. It didn't take long for Struensee to influence the weak state of the king's mind, while at the same time the Queen started to take interest in him romantically. The Queen and Struensee would start their love affair in 1770, and 1 year later, Queen Caroline would give birth to her second child, Princess Louise Augusta. Everyone during that time, and the historians of today, are quite certain that the little princess was the German physician's daughter. She was even called La Petite Struensee in quiet whispers. The physician had an influence on both the king and queen, becoming the de facto ruler of the kingdom at one point. He used his high standings to pass new, liberal ideas based on the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment actually went against nobility, so Struensee made some enemies. Eventually, the aristocracy, whom he made enemies with for his ideals, publicized the affair. Both the Queen and the physician were arrested and charged with adultery. Queen Caroline admitted to it, which dissolved her marriage and caused Struensee to be executed. The Queen was deported and would die at the age of 23 from scarlet fever. Not everyone cheated, so you don't completely lose faith in humanity. There was a faithful king back in the day. George III was married to Princess Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in 1761. He wasn't attracted to her on their wedding day, but eventually they grew to love each other, and she bore 15 of his children. He never cheated on her. Thanks for watching another show of History's Weirdest. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Cheers!